in Pennsylvania to record oral conversations without the permission of the people involved in most circumstances. This session is being recorded for training and/or record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of the session. At any time, if you have a question or comment, feel free to place this in the chat, and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like to ask your question or comment verbally, please note that by doing so, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and the use of the statements recorded as part of this session. Please exit the call if you do not wish to be recorded. You will be able to review the video in its entirety on DDAP's website following this event. Let's get started. Next slide, please.
Is it still showing the title slide?
Yes.
Yeah, this was the issue that we were having.
You want me to just share?
Yeah, that might be what we need to do then. Sorry about that, Amanda. It's on the second slide on mine.
Yeah. So as a reminder, alignment with the ASAM criteria is required of the drug and alcohol treatment providers. Any questions you have regarding the webinar can be written in the chat, and those questions will be answered and posted to the website at a later date. Let's get started with our first poll question. What is your role at your agency? Executive director, clinical director, counselor, administration, medical staff, support staff, case manager, DDAP, SCA, or MCO. If you're not able to access the chat, feel free to put your name and title in the chat. Looks like we mostly have clinical directors and administration, and we'll have DDAP and SCA today. The next poll question. Do you or does your agency currently conduct any type of problem gambling screening during assessments and intake? Yes, no, or you are not sure. Looks like about 66% of you say yes, about 60% now say yes. A little over half of you. All right, our next question. If someone expressed to you that they were experiencing gambling-related issues, would you have the resources to share with them? Looks like nearly 80% of you would have the resources. Thank you so much for your responses. So let's get started today with our presenter. So today's presenter is Josh Ercole. He leads the organization, direction, and coordination of all administrative functions and advocacy efforts at the Council of Compulsive Gambling of Pennsylvania, a team member of CCGP since 2013. He has conducted hundreds of trainings and seminars throughout Pennsylvania to raise awareness of problem gambling and available resources for help. We're excited to have Josh today to present. And at this point, we're going to turn it over to Josh. So welcome.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to DDAP for having us participate in something that, I'm really I'm encouraged to hear that so many of you do have at least some connection to resources, but there are a number of you who may still not. And that's where we thought it would be a good idea to just kind of talk about some of this today. Some of the direction that we can help put you in to help connect you with better resources or more effective resources that you may be aware of. I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleague Amy, who will be doing some of the lifting later on in the program, talking a little bit about some of the services that are available through the Department of Drug and Alcohol programs. But again, thank you, Amanda, for setting this up and for hosting the program and for reaching out. And I'm really I'm excited to be here with you all today. Just a little bit about the council and some of the work that we do. For anyone, I do see a lot of you in the chat box and in the participants list who I recognize and I know, but there are a lot of you who I don't recognize your name. And I want you to know that we exist as a resource in Pennsylvania. One of the primary areas of focus at the council is overseeing the 1-800-GAMBLER number. This is the phone number that serves as a direct link to help for folks all across the Commonwealth. And basically, if someone in Pennsylvania calls 1-800-GAMBLER, they will be put in touch with resources. So I should say, if somebody in Pennsylvania with a Pennsylvania area code calls 1-800-GAMBLER, they'll be put in touch with local and regional resources, things like counseling options, meetings, information about tools and resources that exist. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the program. But I think it's important that you know that we also have other ways to reach out for help. So if you're not familiar with these other options, on our website, which is pacouncil.com, which you see at the bottom of the slide next to me, there are a number of different ways that folks can get access to assistance. There's a lot of downloadable information. There's links that you can use to get to other resources. We try to make it as robust as possible. But regarding the helpline and that 24/7 information that's available, we also have chat and text lines available. So folks can reach out either verbally or through electronic communication, depending on what they're most comfortable discussing with someone in terms of reaching out for assistance. And then in addition to the helpline, we also conduct a lot of training programs all around the state. So we try to work with county groups. We do handle clinical trainings. We do prevention-based programming. We really try to help as many folks as possible all around the Commonwealth have a better understanding of what we see and what we're hearing through some of the phone calls and the conversations that we have with individuals and family members of individuals who are struggling. So again, please, if there's one thing to take away from this program, it's recognizing that there is a very, very direct avenue for help available through the helpline and through our website. And you can always use this. This isn't just for someone who's struggling with a gambling problem. This can be used for information or other resources as well. Next slide, please. So today, what we'll talk about, obviously we've got quite a bit to cover. We're going to kind of just start by talking about gambling and then evolve into the problem gambling discussion. We'll talk a little bit about some of the factors that are often present in the development of a gambling problem, just what we're seeing in terms of how much of an impact gambling is having on some folks' lives. I should start by just saying we are not anti-gambling, so we do take a neutral stance when it comes to participation in gambling or legislation to expand gambling, but what we do want is to make sure that there's language included in some of the legislation. We want to make sure that there are tools and protections available so that we're preventing problems from starting, and then if and when there are problems that develop, we want to make sure that folks can get in touch with help, much like I just talked about. But we'll also talk about some of the warning signs that can be sometimes difficult to navigate, but what we often see associated with a gambling problem, unlike substance related disorders where there might be a physical sign or impact or from the substance, from the chemical reaction. A lot of times with gambling, you're not going to see that. There's not necessarily going to be that same physical impact. So what we need to rely on more might be related to behaviors or emotions or actions or whatever the case may be. And we'll talk a little bit about, just because, again, we do see so many similarities with substances and with mental health issues related to gambling. We'll talk about the importance of identifying the connections that we see there, the fact that we do see these comorbidities, the fact that we do see replacement with gambling, situations that are, maybe someone is in recovery for a substance use disorder and starts gambling, as a way to replace some of the feelings and some of the satisfaction. It's all related to dopamine release and interpretation. And as we continue to see more and more availability and normalization of different types of gambling, that's obviously something that we do see a lot of folks turn to as a way to initially have fun and be entertained, but very quickly we can see that that may change into a problematic relationship. And then obviously we'll, spend some time talking about what's important in terms of reaching out for help. There's screening tools that you can utilize at your practice or at your agency. There's strategies that we'll talk a little bit about how to maybe question, or ask questions or just bring up in terms of dialogue and discussion, some of the things that we often find can be impactful in getting someone to maybe take that step towards addressing an issue that they may be experiencing. And then we'll explore some of the local and regional resources that are available around the state. Again, the hope that is that by the end of the program, you'll have a little bit better understanding. And even if you already have some level of understanding about what help is available, this may help guide you in terms of how you can have initial conversations. And I do have the chat box open because I'm not controlling the slides. I have it on a separate screen, but I will be monitoring that. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter that into the chat box. I'm also fine with if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's fine as well. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I just always want to make sure that your safety and your comfort are, obviously the most important thing. So if there's anything that I'm talking about today, we don't have any imagery, we don't have any videos. There's nothing that will necessarily be visually triggering, but just the subject matter and the discussion in and of itself, for some folks, it can generate emotion. So if there's anything that you see that is uncomfortable for you, please mute me, leave the webinar temporarily. But whatever you need to do to stay safe and comfortable, that's, again, the most important thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so to begin talking about this idea of gambling, right? And we often start out programs by talking about gambling, not problem gambling, because I think it's really important to have that conversation and kind of look at things through the lens of someone who may be experiencing issues or who's participating in gambling, who is maybe not sure what falls under this definition. And in today's world, we hear things like gaming and skill games and games of chance and games in prediction markets and things that can kind of really sort of skirt the boundaries and perimeters of this idea of what is and what isn't gambling. You hear legislative maneuver, you hear court order, you hear all kinds of different situations where it becomes unclear and very blurry what is considered to be some form of gambling. And I think that's an important conversation to have. Now, what we often do is, this is honestly a slide that we could spend an hour on just discussing, different forms of gambling. But I think if we look at the next slide, whenever we have a moment to just advance, this gives a nice definition of what we often look at. And you'll see here that a lot of those different types of activities that I just talked about fall, at least in some way, shape, or form, under this umbrella definition. And that's the activity or practice of playing a game of chance or taking a chance, whether it be for money or for some other stake. And that's a really important piece here, is that it's not always going to be about money. It may be about an item of value. It may be a relationship. It might be a situation where somebody's participating in an activity and, they may not recognize, because it's not a bet that's going to have a financial gain or loss associated with it, they may not feel that really falls under that definition of gambling. But the idea is that obviously there's the hope of winning something and there's the risk of losing something. And that stake, again, depending on what it may be, that could be a financial piece, it could be money or some type of investment, or it could be something again, much different than that. It could be a relationship, it could be respect, it could be time, it could be any number of different things. So when we look at all of these different types of activities and all of these different types of actions that folks may be taking all across the Commonwealth and around the country for that matter, you can see where there are probably a lot of folks who are out there who are participating in different types of gambling who may or may not be aware that they're doing so. And a lot of the work that's being done around the state and around the country is really trying to kind of focus on educating folks about what some of the activities really are and what they're made up of. But again, more important than actually identifying what they are is helping folks identify the fact that there are risks associated with a number of these different activities. And if they don't participate in these activities with some level of education and preparedness, that could really start to progress into a downward situation for them if they're not careful. And that's what we always want to do, is make sure that folks feel comfortable in talking about what types of activities they're engaged in, but if they are engaging in them, that they at least have some level of understanding with regard to some of the risks that are going to sometimes be associated. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at legalized gambling, this is something that's often surprising to a lot of people, just to see how much availability we have. Now, again, this is just legal forms of gambling in Pennsylvania, legislated types of games that are being played across the Commonwealth. With the exception of airport gambling, every one of these types of gambling are currently available. They are regulated. There's legislation that has allowed for these games to be put into play, and they are being participated in all across the Commonwealth. We've seen, obviously, over the years, we've seen a lot of participation in lottery games. We've seen the expansion into casino gaming in the early 2000s. And then just a few years ago, we saw this expansion that allowed for all forms of all different kinds of forms of online availability. So online lottery, online casino gaming, and one that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment, online sports betting, which is obviously something that's gained a tremendous amount of popularity over the last few years. And it's something that we are continuing to see more and more participation in, but also we're seeing, unfortunately, problems that exist as well. Next slide, please. And based on that, we see that there is this high level of involvement. We have this number of forms of gambling available. It's really no surprise that we see high levels of participation. And a recent study last year by Penn State University in partnership with DDAP revealed that nearly 2/3 of Pennsylvania adults had engaged in some form of past 12-month gambling, which is really remarkable when you think about it. Most prevalent studies that we see show that there are high rates of lifetime gambling. There are high rates of participation that go within that 12-month period, but this really exceeds that. And what we're seeing, obviously, is a lot of different types of activities that folks are engaged in. The most popular being lottery games, but we've seen, as we've moved into this mobile and digital world, more and more folks who are participating in different forms of online offerings. And when we look more closely at those different forms of online offerings, sports betting is clearly the most popular type of online gambling format. Again, we'll continue talking a little bit more about that, but I think it's important when we see this high level of involvement. Next slide, please. We are going to see situations where we have different levels of participation and different levels of potential impact that may have. So as you look at this continuum and you see how the circles are kind of moving down the continuum, it's important to recognize that we don't have folks that either don't gamble or gamble and have fun with it, or have people who are losing everything, right? There's a lot of ways that we could see problems start to develop along this path. Yes, you do have folks that don't gamble. That's typically a very small percentage of the population. Most people fall within that wide range there, that wide area that's often noted as social, sometimes called responsible, fun, entertainment. This is what we want to see if somebody's going to gamble, is that they're having fun and enjoying themselves. Maybe they're sticking to limits. Maybe they're putting themselves in a position where it's not negatively impacting their life. That's, again, if someone chooses to participate in some type of gambling, that's the hope, is that they're going to start out in this area and remain there. And let's face it, most people will. When we look at different types of studies and the rates of folks who develop problems, most people are able to stay here. But one of the things that we always try to really share with folks is the fact that anyone who gambles is at risk of developing a problem. It doesn't mean that everyone who gambles will develop a problem, far from it. But again, everyone who gambles and puts themselves in a position where they're, again, placing something at risk of losing a stake, they are potentially at risk of developing a problem. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The important piece here is that those problems aren't always going to be glaringly obvious, and they're not always going to be incredibly detrimental to individuals. They might be situations where maybe somebody's just not sticking to limits that they once stuck to. So an example of this might be someone who is going to a casino with friends on a Friday night, and they're going for 2 or 3 hours, and they're taking a budgeted amount of money with them. But maybe they're able to stick to those limits for a period of time, but every once in a while they might extend beyond them. Maybe they start to spend a little bit more money, or maybe they start to visit by themselves. They don't want to leave when their friends leave, so they decide they're going to go on their own. None of this is necessarily an identifiable or definable problem, but what we're seeing now are shifts. We're seeing shifts with the activity, shifts with the relationship with the activity. And that's where we get concerned, because if someone's not careful, they may start to find themselves working their way down this continuum towards that more importantly and impactful area of problem and ultimately disordered gambling, which is really what we look at as the most severe type of problem. This is where we see a dramatic impact. It's typically not solely financial. We see a number of areas of a person's life being impacted by their participation in gambling. And the concern is that if someone doesn't recognize the slight move that they're making from one category to the next, from social to at risk to starting to see some of the problems that may develop and be associated with their participation. The concern is that we're going to see that develop into a more severe issue that's often identified as disordered gambling. Next slide, please. And again, as we continue talking about these different types of levels, this is where it can sometimes be tricky. Because of the limited amount of physical impact that we often see. This is a question we often ask, is what are some signs that someone may be having a problem or may be exhibiting a problem? How do you identify someone who is struggling with a gambling problem? How do you identify it if you know that they gamble regularly? And how do you identify it if you don't know that they're gambling? Right? So there's a lot here to look at. And typically what we find is that, going back to that term, that disordered gambling. Next slide, please. If we look at the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, within the DSM-5, there are diagnostic criteria that are required to be met. A minimum of 4 of these criteria are required to be met in order for someone to achieve a gambling disorder diagnosis. These criteria are often what we look at when we discuss the idea of warning signs. If we see someone who is becoming more preoccupied with gambling, if they start talking about it or looking forward to it, if it becomes a bigger part of their area of focus, this could be a sign that something's going on. And a lot of times what we do is not necessarily use these tools solely for the sake of diagnosing a problem, but we use them to hopefully identify that someone's relationship with gambling is reaching a point where maybe it's something that we need to address. So if we see somebody that is, increasing intolerance, the way that they participate in gambling, if we see someone who tries to stop suddenly or cut down on their gambling and feels some type of emotional or behavioral or even physical impact, that could be a sign of withdrawal, similar to what we see with substance use withdrawal. Obviously, a lot of these signs, they can be looked at in a number of different ways. And there are a lot of areas of overlap between gambling and with other types of disorders, with substance-related disorders. And what we find is that they can often mirror one another. And when we see situations where there is loss of control, where there are elements where somebody may not be forthcoming or honest about their participation or how much they've lost, where there are situations where relationships are being risked, you see there is a lot of overlap and there's a lot of connectivity. And when we talk in a moment about some of the connections that substance use disorder and gambling disorder may have with one another, you can see how that could easily be something that is replaced as someone goes into recovery for one type of disorder or another. But again, in looking at some of the warning signs and how they're often displayed here or how they're often identified, I think it really is important to remember that even though there's no chemical being ingested, there's nothing going into the body, a lot of the responses and behaviors that can be associated with someone developing a problem, they can be very powerful and requiring that person to continue engaging in the activity to receive that same level of satisfaction. And a lot of times what I talked about before was somebody who goes to a casino with friends, but then all of a sudden feels that they're not necessarily staying as long as they'd like, so they want to stay longer. Maybe they're not getting the same satisfaction playing one slot machine, so they start playing the machine in front of them and the machine on either side as well. When we have these different types of increased tolerances and when we have loss of control that may start to develop as a result of that increased tolerance, it's important to look at the different types of accessibility that we now have. And going just a few years ago, when yes, casinos were open and they were open 24 hours, and it was entirely possible for someone to travel to a casino and then sit down and stay in that seat for as long as they want, there were different types of approaches that were often taken. There were a number of casinos that would look at this and approach somebody if they felt that they were maybe starting to exhibit signs of excess. They would maybe approach them and ask them if they'd like to take a break, or they'd sometimes forcibly remove individuals from the property. But when we now have this online world, which is much more anonymous, it's much more difficult to identify folks in situations like this. But in addition to that, from the player's perspective, it's so much easier to access. So when we now have a situation, if there are folks who can now access a casino gaming floor by simply reaching over to their nightstand and grabbing their mobile device, and now they have access for as long as they'd like. You can see how some of these different types of activities could really begin to grow in terms of how much participation there is. And when we have these different types of areas of crossover, the concern is that folks are not necessarily going to recognize that their behaviors or the activities that they're participating in are starting to go down this potentially dangerous path. Next slide, please. So the next question would be, what impact might this have on a person's life? When we're looking at different types of gambling, it's important to recognize how could we maybe look at this and see how it's impacting someone's own life, but what are we seeing in terms of how it's impacting not just them, but the people around them? Because a lot of times what we find is that yes, there are percentages, there are rates, prevalence rates that can be assigned through national and international surveys. But when we look at the true impact that gambling may have on someone's life, it often goes well beyond just impacting the individual themselves. So that's where we often see situations where friends and family members may be impacted. And a lot of the research reflects that anywhere from 8 to 10 people are the numbers that we often see. 8 to 10 other people in that person's life are impacted. And when we look at the different types of impact, the different consequences of the development of some type of gambling addiction, you can see that there's a number of different ways that this could negatively impact not just a person, but the overall community as a whole. A lot of times we'll see that connection that I talked about to other mental health issues and maybe substance related issues. We see a lot of relationship problems. We see family arguments. We see high divorce rates, but we also see it extend into other areas of life outside of the family as well. So we do see situations where there might be job loss or maybe disrupted education. We see legal conflicts that often develop. Sometimes for the individual themselves, we can actually see a high level of health issues, and that's often related to not taking care of the physical condition that somebody may be in because they're so preoccupied with the gambling component. Maybe we see situations where they're not focusing on that, so it becomes that secondary concern, and a lot of times this can really develop into a significant problem. And unfortunately what we often find is Reports show very high rates of suicide ideation and attempts among folks who are struggling with gambling related issues, typically much higher than what we see with other disorders. So when we look at situations like that, it's obviously something that I think is a important component to have conversations about. Next slide, please. And this is why we often talk about this importance of asking questions. So at your practice, whether you work at an SCA and you work in prevention, what are you doing to talk about gambling? What are you doing to educate about gambling out in the community, whether it be in schools or senior centers or community centers or whatever the situation is? And how are you approaching that conversation? And what are you seeing if you're doing anything about that at this point? If you're in a treatment facility, what questions are you asking at screening, at assessments and intakes? What types of interviews are you having? What types of discussions are you having? And what's the feedback that you're receiving when you're asking these questions? You know, the importance that's often been found is that by addressing situations related to problem gambling, if we're not asking questions or not asking them effectively, what it could be doing is not effectively and holistically treating the individual who's sitting across the desk from you or the group that you're addressing. And that's where we see these high rates of comorbidity. And we're going to just talk about this for a moment. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a diagram that was put together. This is from Canada's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. And it's a nice broad section look at the intersections that we often see gambling and problem gambling having with a number of different mental health and substance related situations. And what's been found over the course of the past 20 years or so is that repeatedly, when there are studies done, we see very, very high rates of different types of comorbidity between different types of mental health issues with different types of situations related to other neuro and physiological development, and how folks may start to turn towards gambling to relieve situations that they may be struggling with, but also situations that stem from participation in gambling that turns into a problematic relationship. So we see a lot of situations where there are high rates of depression and anxiety. A lot of the research that we find typically falls in the 50 and 60% range. But it's important to look at that. And there's been studies that really kind of focus on and even pathways to identify subtypes that have explored which comes first. Are we seeing situations where the depression or the anxiety stems from the development of a gambling problem, or are we seeing situations where folks who are experiencing depression and anxiety may start to turn towards gambling as a way to relieve some of the tension and some of the situations that they're feeling? So, you know, looking at some of these different types of subtypes and looking at some of the DSM-5 criteria, escape was one of the things that we see outlined as the identifiable criteria. You know, that idea of escape, this can often fall into this category where somebody may be using gambling as a way of escaping the anxiety or the trauma or the feelings that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, because the gambling, the way that it interprets or the way that their brain interprets the activity, it's giving them that sense of relief. And when somebody sits at a slot machine or logs into their mobile device and starts to experience these feelings of euphoria, it can really overpower them. And in some ways, it's often been found that it's not related to any type of financial gain, but the win is interpreted based on the feelings that they have, the negative feelings being removed, and that positive feeling of reinforcement that they're starting to experience as a result of the participation. So something to be concerned about. Obviously, if someone is not prepared to enter into this type of activity and they start to feel these positive outcomes, whether they're winning or losing the financial piece or the financial part of the activity, it could start to develop into a pattern that ultimately does begin to have a negative impact on their life. We see, as you see here on this wheel, there's also high rates of different levels of trauma. There's situations where folks have endured childhood trauma that has followed them into adulthood. There's physical abuse. There's domestic violence that we often see playing a role in the development of gambling problems. And, you know, when we look at situations where we have high rates of folks who are experiencing, again, high rates of depression, high rates of anxiety. A lot of times they may stem as well from situations like trauma or other types of problems that folks may be experiencing throughout their lifespan. And gambling fits so nicely into a way that they could turn to hopefully, in their eyes, shed some relief on the negative impact that these other situations are experiencing, or causing rather. With regard to other situations, gambling and ADHD, gambling and bipolar disorder, a lot of the DSM-5 criteria focuses on the gambling and the participation in the gambling, relieving and providing immediate rewards to situations where folks may be experiencing these types of situations. But it is outlined that they cannot necessarily be completely explained by another form of a manic disorder. That being said, we are seeing these high rates of situations where somebody may be experiencing bipolar disorder, somebody may be experiencing these manic episodes, and at the same time also developing different types of gambling issues as well. And then finally, on the left-hand side of the slide here, the substance use disorders. And again, what we're finding is that year after year, high rates of results in different types of studies looking at comorbidities, high rates of alcohol use disorder, rates as high as 75 and 80% in some of the studies that we see over the course of the past 20 years or so. Also, very high rates of nicotine dependence, high rates of experiencing different types of drug and narcotic related disorders. So when we see high rates, 40, 50, 60% among all substances, also at the same time taking place with regard to the development of gambling issues, it's so important, again, to identify that in order to effectively treat or effectively address the situation, again, whether it be from a preventive standpoint or from a treatment-based standpoint, that we continue to bring gambling into the dialogue, that we continue to talk about it in the prevention programs that we're incorporating in schools, that we're incorporating in senior centers and out into the community, but also that we're asking questions at intakes, during initial assessments, during interviews, but we're also making this something that is not necessarily this fringe discussion point, but part of an existing infrastructure. And that's where, next slide, please. That's where we feel it's so important and it's so effective that rather than creating another silo and reinventing the wheel or adding a tremendous amount of work to our caseloads, is that we simply integrate into existing discussion and in following what we often find in recovery-oriented systems of care is that we create a multitude of different pathways for recovery. And ultimately identify that there are no wrong doors that someone can go through in order to access treatment. So the more that we're continuing to see gambling become available and be something that folks continue to struggle with, the importance of having these different types of services available becomes so incredibly important. So again, not looking at this as something that we need to do in isolation from other work that we're already doing, but integrate it into existing conversation. And that's what we're going to do and spend the rest of the time today talking about is how can we maybe start to identify some things and some ways to talk about this type of situation, that crosses into discussion about a number of different areas of focus. Now, let me just take a look at the chat box. I just wanted to see it. I saw a question come in. Are phone apps included for problem gambling prevention and treatment? With in-app purchases for extra lives, coins, power-ups, etc., individuals can end up playing longer than intended and start spending a lot of money to keep playing. Thank you very much for that question. Yes, what we often find is there's a lot of crossover between different elements within video games as well as gambling games. And a lot of those elements really do stem from that idea of gambling. When we see a lot of the things that you're talking about here, where there is some type of in-app purchase, sometimes those in-app purchases can be related to games of chance. Sometimes they're direct purchases where you get something for what amount of money you put into that app, but there are other ways that you can purchase different types of games of chance. And a lot of times what we do find is that there are these levels of connection that are priming younger folks who are participating in these games at high rates for future participation in different types of gambling activities. And while it's unclear yet that this is going to have a direct relationship to the development of the problems or of future problems, it's very likely that there's going to at least be some comfort that someone has in participating with the game. And again, like we talked about earlier, any participation in gambling is ultimately increasing or at least putting someone at risk of developing a future problem. So that's again why having education programs that are designed in talking about video games and talking about the connectivity between video games and gambling is so vitally important. And yes, we are fortunate in Pennsylvania that providers who offer gambling treatment services are also able to offer video game treatment services for situations where somebody may be struggling with either a connected problem or a problem solely for video games. So I hope that answers your question. And again, please feel free if you have any questions to put them in the chat box. I didn't see any others come in, but if I missed any, please let me know. And if there are, again, any other areas outside of video games that you'd like to discuss, we can always explore some of the other topics. Again, I mentioned some of them earlier, things that are really kind of on that hot topic level with regard to games that aren't necessarily identified as gambling activities today. They do have those same elements. And that's where we see a lot of the connectivity is that even if it isn't necessarily legislated as a gambling game or doesn't necessarily under court ruling be have that gambling stamp or the regulatory oversight, what we find is that there are so many folks that aren't necessarily aware of those differences. And their participation in these games is resulting in problems that very closely mirror what we see folks who are struggling with other types of legislated gambling are experiencing. So the fact of the matter is that whether we call it gambling or it's not gambling or it's a game that somebody has some type of relationship with, there's always that potential for a potential negative relationship to develop. And that's what we want to explore is the fact that if someone is struggling out in the community, that we have a network of resources that they can access. And whether it be a strictly regulated and legislated gambling game or something that falls outside of that assignment, these same screens and these same tools, they can all apply. And when we look at some of the different screens that exist, next slide, please. On our website, we have a wide range of different types of screening tools that are posted. And some of these screens are brief screens, just 2 or 3 questions. Some of you may use some of these screens. Some of them are a little bit more intense and a little bit more extensive that go into history and gather a lot of information. We want you to feel free to use these screens any way that you feel may benefit the folks that you're working with. And even if that's simply going into the screens to look at what questions are being asked and generate discussion from them, that's in many ways the way that these screens are most effectively going to be used. If we go to the next slide, some of the screens that we have, they really explore some base level, broad strokes approaches towards having conversations. But it's very unlikely that by asking a question like, do you gamble, that you're going to get an extensive response. If you'd hit the next button, please. In many ways, this might be a situation where, going back to the initial discussion that we talked about, there may be a misunderstanding of what falls under that umbrella of gambling. It might be a situation where somebody's not ready to talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. They can see through the question. But a lot of times, if we're asking a closed-ended question like, do you gamble? You're very likely not going to get the response. And what they may interpret that question as is, if you hit the next button, please, you might start to get, this idea that somebody's not recognizing gambling as being, the activities they're participating in because they feel that it's going to a casino or it's only betting on a sporting event. And they may not recognize that buying lottery tickets or some of the other activities that we talked about may fall under that definition. So their response may be very, very abrupt and very brief, and it may be something that doesn't necessarily tap into or generate the discussion that you're hoping. So you might get a response like this: nope, nothing at all. So next slide, please. That really brings us to that question of what else could you ask and how might you ask it? And this is where it's an important piece to look at and think about critically, that what are we going to talk about? How are we going to generate discussion based on this topic? This topic that often is something that folks do not necessarily want to talk about, that they might be, not recognizing as a problem. They might not necessarily want to explore stopping. They might be at a different area of their stages of change and readiness than they are with their substance use issue or their mental health concerns. So how do we start to establish the fact that talking about this in this environment is something we can do? It's safe. And how do we try to begin moving that needle in a positive direction so that we can start addressing what may be a problematic relationship? So next slide, please. This is where allowing for open-ended dialogue can often be very, very beneficial. This is where looking at ways to maybe generate discussion. And this is just one example. What do you do for fun, to relieve stress, for entertainment, to be social? Do you have any favorite leisure activities? Now we're not asking a yes or no question, but we're going to get a response that might be something along the lines of this, where I don't necessarily, I usually hang out with friends. We don't really do a lot, but sometimes we go to the movies, sometimes we go to a concert. Maybe we just get together to play cards. And we also like to eat out sometimes and, then maybe find a bingo game somewhere. So you can see here, just by changing the way that a question's being asked, you're all of a sudden opening up the dialogue for more of a discussion. And this isn't necessarily saying that now we know that somebody participates in gambling, so we need to tell them that it's wrong or that they should stop or they have a problem. Far, far from that. But what it's now doing is it's establishing a foundation that we can build from. So next slide, please. So what we often find is that if we're going to kind of approach this discussion, and this is a very, very basic level discussion, given the time that we have, on ways to maybe work through some of this dialogue. But what's often used is very similar to the SBIRT model that we see used with substance use disorder, is that can be applied very nicely to this idea of identifying potential gambling issues. So if we have that initial question, if we can at least establish that there is some level of participation, we can very smoothly start to generate discussion about what type of involvement there is. So asking initially, during the past 12 months, how many times have you gambled? The reason that this is the number that's asked, or that this is the questions asked, is that because there have been studies that have been found that gambling 5 or more times within a 12-month period puts someone at a significantly higher level of risk than someone who is not gambling with that frequency. And it makes sense if you think about it. What it does now is it's a situation where somebody is gambling every couple of months, there's an occasional relationship at a minimum, and that with an activity like that, if that ongoing relationship continues, it could be something that starts to expand. Typically, someone who's gambling less than that, they're not at risk, but it's not quite as it's not something that they're involved with as frequently as someone who's gambling a little bit more regularly. And again, not to say that someone who's gambling 5 or more times in a 12-month period is going to develop a problem, but the involvement and the relationship there is going to allow for that to escalate at a quicker rate in most cases than what we might see with somebody who's gambling less. If you go to the next slide, what this will help us determine then is, how do we address future questions? How do we address additional discussion? And this is being built using the model that was in the brief screen list that I showed just a moment ago. This comes from the Brief Biosocial Gambling Screen, or the BBGS, which is available on our website. And it's built from 3 questions. Have you ever felt restless, on edge, or irritable when trying to stop, cut down, or cut down on gambling? And this obviously pulls from that withdrawal piece that I talked about during the DSM-5 criteria. The next question would be, have you tried to keep it a secret just how much you gambled? or been gambling from your family or friends. So this, in a very, very smooth and non-judgmental way, addresses the lying component from the criteria. And then finally, the bailout piece, which is, have you ever had to ask other people for money to help you deal with financial problems or situations that have been caused by gambling? And by asking this brief screen, what this is now doing is generating, again, this discussion. It's establishing that this is something we can talk about. We can talk about it today, or we can talk about it at a future session. And if you're working from that preventive standpoint, this is a good way to kind of generate in discussion with the folks that you're working with, not necessarily to identify or diagnose a problem, but to talk about it, to gauge involvement. This can be a nice way to kind of bring this into the discussion and establish again that this is something that we can talk about. And then based on that, moving from that screening area into additional questioning and that brief intervention assessment. Next slide, please. This is where we could ask other questions, and you can get creative here. You could talk about different approaches that might build off of the DSM-5 criteria. Have you gambled to escape from stress or negative feelings, or have you felt the need to bet more and more? Has there been that ongoing preoccupation or that growing need to participate? Have you found yourself focusing on trying to win back money that you lost? This explores that idea of chasing. Next slide, please. And you can continue building upon that by asking other questions and learning more. So on our website, we have information about different ways that problems are often developed. We might talk about how myths might be misconstrued and how they often develop and how there's facts related to gambling, but a lot of times people might not necessarily identify what is or is not a myth related to gambling. There's a lot. For years, there's been myths about slot machines and how to most effectively play slot machines to have the greatest amount of win. But learning more about how these games work and how there's random number generators that predict not what wins will happen necessarily, but it's all about timing, and it has nothing to do with, this machine is lucky on Mondays, or this machine hasn't paid off in so long and it's overdue. A lot of times what we find is that situations start to really drive behaviors, and the more we can identify that this is not necessarily the case and help people understand better, that can really go a long way in helping them to start to shape their relationship and plant that seed to help them better understand how participating in certain types of gambling may have these increased levels of risk. But talking about the fact that this is not something like we talked about before with that continuum, that there are wide ranges of how someone may develop a problem, explore ways to prevent problems from escalating or starting in the first place. Again, even if we have folks that aren't gambling frequently, this is still an ideal time to have conversations. So by limiting money, by limiting the amount of time, by not viewing gambling as a way of making money, and by encouraging folks to spend time on multiple recreational activities and not just focusing on one type of activity like something that has these inherent risks. And as we review this process, next slide, please. Again, just looking at this initial screening that we can talk about, where we ask a very brief number of questions that kind of generates that initial discussion. Next slide. And then leads to potentially a brief intervention if that's something that seems to be the most appropriate next course of action. And finally, next slide, going to that referral for treatment. And that might be at your agency, it might be at another agency in your area. Fortunately, the Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs has permanently approved telehealth. So between the treatment providers that exist, next slide, please, and the ones who are offering not only in-person but telehealth options, there's a multitude of different ways that folks can access treatment options in Pennsylvania, not to mention online recovery groups as well as in-person meetings. And by using the 800 Gambler number, by using the Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs website, as well as our website, there's access to all of these different types of help and assistance. Next slide, please. I'd like to, at this point, open the microphone up to Amy Hubbard, who'd like to talk just a little bit about what I just started talking about with that treatment provider network in Pennsylvania, and how this might be something that if you're interested or someone at your agency is interested in offering gambling treatment services, what steps are involved in that process. Amy?
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Josh. As Josh mentioned, we do have options available for treatment providers. In Pennsylvania, we offer reimbursement for outpatient treatment for individuals who are underinsured or uninsured. DDAP offers a contract where treatment providers can reach out to us and ask for this contract, and they can receive this reimbursement if they're treating for outpatient for problem gambling. So I have my email address on here. If you guys are interested at all, or you just want to have more information and talk about this opportunity, please reach out to me in email. The reimbursement includes for individuals and their affected others, so family members that are affected by problem gambling. It includes reimbursement for individual sessions or group sessions, and they can be done in person or via telehealth. We do offer the virtual 30-hour problem gambling training that you would need with this contract, but we've made the process as easy as possible. So I'll just leave it at that, but please feel free to reach out if you have any more or any questions and you want more information. Thanks, Josh.
Sure thing. Thanks, Amy. I see in the chat box there's a question about the 30-hour trainings. Yes, in 2026 there will be 3 sessions offered. One starts in mid-January, and then I believe the next one starts in April, and then there'll be another one in the fall. I think that one is in September. I'm not sure what the availability for the January program is, but the TMS site is where you can go to find out that information. And you can also add your name to a favorites list, I guess not a list, but you can favorite the activity or the session, and then that'll notify you on your dashboard when you log in. You can also enroll in our email, which is a monthly newsletter that we send out. You can do that on our website's homepage, and that information would be sent out monthly. And when that training goes live, we include that in the email and put it on our website as well. Next slide, please. Just to kind of explore what we're looking at. What Amy just talked about obviously focuses on that direct treatment for individuals or for group treatment processes. And that is something that is incredibly effective and one of the primary things that we talk about when we get calls to the helpline. But there are going to be folks that might not necessarily adhere to working with a treatment provider. And that's why we feel it's so important to have these multiple approaches towards helping someone. That's why we have a number of different types of online options available as well as in-person options. So on our website, you can find information about the self-help meetings and recovery groups that exist. And when you get the slides, you'll have the websites that you can access. Here on the slide now, you see the Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board's website, the responsibleplay.pa.gov website. This is something that has really generated a lot of participation over the past 25 years or so since, or 20 years ago, I guess at this point, since casino gambling and then eventually online options have become available. This is where someone who's interested in setting self-imposed limits, or if they are struggling, or even if they're not struggling, but want to put a barrier between themselves and gambling, they can go to enroll in what's referred to as the self-exclusion program. And the self-exclusion program is essentially a voluntary confidential ban where folks who are struggling or again just want to put that barrier between themselves and the activity, they can enroll in the program and they will not be permitted, based on the terms of the program they select, to enter a casino or log into an online account during those terms. Next slide, please. In addition to the Gaming Control Board, there are also third-party groups. We partner with a group called Gamban. This also serves as an online bet blocker. So for someone who's struggling with gambling or wants to put a barrier between themselves and online apps, this covers both legislated as well as unlegislated and unregulated forms of gambling. There are thousands of different websites that are blocked, and this is a subscription service. We at the council, we cover the costs for folks that are working with providers or who are experiencing issues and looking to put some type of distance between themselves and these access points. It can be really beneficial. So, when we look at the different options that exist, we have a lot of ways that folks can electronically or in person, again, put themselves in a position that maybe uses these tools in an effective way. For those of you working in either prevention or treatment, we also have a number of different cards on our website that you can download. You can also contact me. I'd be happy to send you cards. But these cards, a lot of times, it can be a very passive and informational way of really just raising awareness and spreading information. When we look at different ways that folks may access forms of gambling, sometimes they want to feel like they're being addressed directly. So we do have general message cards, but we have cards that are aimed at a number of different types of games as well as different demographics. And I think that's an important component of the information dissemination. Then finally, what we find is that most people out there are gambling. It's supported, it's participated in, it's fun. And what we find typically based on prevalence is that most people are not developing problems. But some will. And what we find is that when we have situations like this where some folks will be developing problems, next slide, please. It's important to just look at what we're seeing. And you can see here that over the past few years, not only has participation, not only has revenue increased based on gaming control board reports and what we find in terms of access and availability, we've also seen problems increase. So between calls for help and chat and text for help that continue to increase over the course of the past several years, we just continue to see a greater need for discussion, a greater need for resources, and we invite you all to use our website as one of those resources. So pacouncil.com is the way to access it. And if there's anything that we can share or that we can provide to you, this is my phone number and my email address. Anything that we can help with, this is what we want to do and we want to be able to offer you. So we're coming right up on time. I just wanted to take a look and see, I see some of the, there's been some discussion in the chat box. Hey, Jason, it's great to see you. Thank you so much, for that, and we appreciate the input. Jason Harlan with Wyoming Valley Alcohol and Drug. He's been working with us, a friend and colleague for many years, and we appreciate all of your support and ongoing participation in programs. If there's there's several folks who are working all across the state that we really try to help have a better understanding of the tools and the connection. I know you're all busy. I know there's a lot that you're involved with. This is one of the things that we focus on most directly and continuously. So we try to really serve as a connection and a resource to all things related to problem gambling. Thank you, Amy, for putting the Responsible Play website in there. Yes, Grace, there's a number of different forms of options. I think there's 4 different options plus a lottery option on the lottery's website. So yes, it can be casino. Yes, it can be online. There's a number of different ways that folks can participate in self-exclusion. And it's a very robust program, and one that's been used for many, many years, and by thousands and thousands of people. Lonnie, as far as the training, asking those questions, please feel free to contact me. Again, I'll put my my email address in the chat box, and we can talk a little bit more about some of those requirements. But if any of you have any questions or anything that we can help with, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you all for your time today. And again, Amanda, thanks for having us. And I hope the last hour was beneficial for you. But if there's anything we can help with, we can always talk again after, and we appreciate your participation. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Josh. We want to thank Josh for presenting today. It was very educational and informative. Our next TA call will be March 2nd of 2026, and the topic will be determined at that time. We'll see you next year. Hope you have a great rest of your day.